This week, many of us will be observing our Yom HaShoah in many different ways. Sometimes you live in a town with someone you see every single day of your life, and you don't really know about them. More than 900 Jews fleeing Nazi Germany sailed with the SS St. Louis to what they hoped would be a safe haven in Cuba. After being turned away from Cuba and the United States, the refugees were finally able to dock in Belgium. However, more than 250 of them were killed as the Nazis swept across Europe. Highland Park's very own resident, Mrs. Ruth Bickhardt, was a child on the SS St. Louis. Tonight, we honor her here for what she lived through, and most importantly, for what she means to us here in Highland Park. Today I have a proclamation that I want to read to you. Ms. Bickhardt, why don't you come up here with me? Whereas, pursuant to an act of Congress, the United States Holocaust Memorial Council has designated these dates as days of remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust. And whereas the history of the Holocaust provides the opportunity to reflect on the moral responsibilities of individuals, societies, and governments, and their efforts to overcome prejudice through education and reflection. And whereas with sadness we remember the victims, with admiration we remember the resistors and rescuers, and with respect we remember the survivors who were sheltered, escaped, or freed, and who lived to contribute so much to our community and our world. And whereas we have an obligation to ensure that the memory and legacy of lives lost or forever changed in this horrific event are never forgotten. And whereas Ruth Bickhardt was a child that set sail on the SS St. Louis with German refugees escaping Nazism in 1939, the ship was turned away by several countries in the Americas, refusing to give the refugees entry before returning to Europe and finally docking in Belgium. And whereas Ruth Bickhardt did finally get to the United States, living in New Brunswick before moving to Highland Park in 2003, and whereas Ruth Bickhardt is very active in the community, she regularly walks around the streets of Highland Park and frequently attends Borough Council meetings where she brings important issues to the governing body's attention. And whereas Ruth Bickhardt, as part of the Safe Walking and Cycling Committee, was instrumental in bicycle helmet education for cyclists and for the creation of educational flyers, she also serves on the Highland Park Juvenile Conference Committee. And whereas the borough and residents of Highland Park wish to honor Ruth Bickhardt for her long history of contributions to Highland Park. Now, therefore I, Gail Brill-Midler, Mayor of the Borough of Highland Park, do hereby declare this date as Yom HaShoah Remembrance Day in our community, and be it further resolved that we pledge today to firmly commit ourselves to say never again, and to work to promote human dignity by confronting intolerance and hate whenever and wherever it exists. In witness hereof, I sign my name. Thank you, Mrs. Bickhardt. Okay, we'll come back to you in 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so...
Thank you. That's the honor. I don't have anything. I got lots of pictures of me, but none for the mayor.
Okay, we will come back to Mrs. Bickhardt, who's going to be talking with us about her experiences, her life, and what it is like here in Highland Park.
You can verify most of what I'm going to tell you in this book. It's called To Hope and Back, and it comes from the Highland Park Library. I lent my copies out, and they haven't returned. And then I have one from the Holocaust Museum. I made notes, so my mind keeps wandering. Okay. All right. The St. Louis was a ship that we sailed on, and I'm sure it was specifically planned that it would sail on a Saturday because it's the holy day for the Jews. So we arrived in Hamburg on Friday, spent the night in a hotel, and then the next day, I don't know whether my mother called a cab or whether the steamship company made arrangements, because there were other people who were going on the ship as well. We got a surprise visitor, a friend of my father's that we didn't know was coming to see us off in Hamburg, because where we lived in Breslau was a, 6-8 hour journey. And he came he slept in the bathtub for the night, and he had brought us roller skates. There was my mother, brother, and I. So for my brother and me, the old-fashioned clip-on with a key roller skates. That was going to be our entertainment on the ship. We boarded the ship sometime in the late Saturday morning, and there was another woman on the ship who was traveling with a daughter, a year younger than myself. And my mother, when we were seated for the dinner hour together, my mother quickly learned that this woman was not Jewish. And whoever hears this, please, we are not bigots. This was just, I don't know how, I can't think of the right word to explain this, but we were the oppressed ones. And of all the people on the ship, my mother felt she didn't merit this. There should have been some other Jewish woman who could empathize with her being alone on the ship with the two children. I was 10, my brother was 11, and this girl of 9 and the mother. That turned out to be the blessing of the journey, and she became an integral part of our life until she passed away. And this past Sunday, I had the joy, and there's no other way to describe it, of having her grandchildren coming to have lunch with me and sharing some of the memories that they knew that their mother had passed on. Their grandmother had died. The girl barely knew the grandmother. She was an infant when the grandmother passed away. So, but they were a very closely knit family. How she played the role in the end, I'll tell you in a little while. So we were seated together in the dining room. This was a luxury ship, and service and everything was deluxe. I'm having some trouble seeing, so give me one moment. Okay, my mother became seasick almost as soon as the boat started to juggle on the water. What am I doing? Oh, thank you. And we didn't know what to do for our mother. And this woman, I will give you, her name is Annie. She was a dentist, her father was a dentist, and her husband was a physician. So she had a medical background. And the medication that the ship doctor prescribed did not agree with my mother. So she became the custodian, the caregiver, the nurse. She spent all her time with my mother, and after 2 or 3 days, we switched. The daughter came to sleep with us, and the two women stayed together because Annie was concerned about the medication that was being administered, that she might not survive this journey. And we kids were pretty much alone during the day. We went roller skating. We drove the people nuts, but we also had access to the other recreational facilities. We went swimming, and we played some games. We played jacks and wrote down. We basically had a good time on the journey, and the weather was invariably good. We made one stop in France, and I think we stopped and where some people came on board, and another family boarded in Belgium, and we found out coincidentally that they had at one time lived in our town, and that their older son and my brother had been in the same Jewish school together. And they were going to the States to reunite with her husband, who had been able to get out sometime earlier in '38. And she had the same misfortune that we had. She also went back and subsequently was able to get out a second time, because we saw each other in New York when we got there. She got out earlier than we did. Let's see. Well, then we came to Cuba. We arrived early morning to the sunrise. I remember it was a beautiful trip, and we were all packed up and ready to disembark, and we waited. They gave us a light breakfast because we were supposed to have been off the boat by 8 o'clock. But nobody was going anywhere. And my mother, who was very shaky on her feet because it was the first time that she was out of bed and walking around, and they just said there seemed to be some problems, but they're working these things out. And then little boats started to appear on the side of the ship, and family members, their husbands invariably, were coming looking for family members on the ship, because that was the only way that they could communicate. And lo and behold, nothing for disembarkment. There were about 20 people who had the necessary documents that suddenly they said you needed. I don't remember what the papers were, but there were about 20 people who had those, and they were allowed to disembark, and the rest of us were stuck. And then all of a sudden we saw a little boat in which my father showed up, and there were some other people on there, so we could wave to each other and could yell to each other, but that was about as close a contact as we could have. And then my father found out that we had met this woman, and it turned out that he lived in the same rooming house as my father. So they became acquainted, and they bonded. And for the next few days while we were lying in the Havana harbor, they would come together. And long and short of it is, the politics in Havana, there was nothing we could do about it. They wanted money that nobody wanted to raise, and the American government didn't want to support that, and the Jewish community in America couldn't raise the enormous amount. I just read the other day that in 1939, the amount came to about $125,000. And I think they came up with about 15,000, which was a large sum of money for that time anyway. So the captain was ordered to pull out of Cuban waters, and he sailed towards Florida in the hope that the Jewish organizations in New York would be able to convince Roosevelt to allow us to come in. And we were that close to Florida that we could count the cars that were driving along the waterway there. But that only lasted for a couple of days, and then we had to pull out as well. And while we were slowly moving out, and as children, we weren't very perturbed about this. We felt secure. There was nothing we could do anyway, and nobody was talking about danger. Nobody could envision what ultimately would come out of what the Germans had really planned. So a couple of days after, when we finally told that we had to go back to Europe, or towards Europe, then my mother told us that the captain had issued orders to inquire. I think Belgium was the first country that offered hospitality if there were other European countries that would share. And so people had to indicate if they had family or friends or any preferences where they would want to go. Now, it turned out that my father had cousins that had been in London already from the early 30s, maybe before Hitler came to soon after Hitler came to power in the 20s. And so she had actually expressed preference for England, and a second choice, France, because she spoke French fluently. Both Annie and my mother spoke French fluently. That was the language that educated people spoke. And so we ended up in France. The boat went to Antwerp, and from there we disembarked, and we were then allocated to smaller ships to take us to our destination. And so we came to France, and we were put on a train. And I can't tell you the exact way that we traveled, but I know that the town that we ended up in was called Laval, on the River Mayenne. And if you look on a map, it's there. So it's northwestern part of France. It's a very little village. We got there at the end of June, and we were put up in an inn. They had some boarding facilities. They had a restaurant there, and there would be a farmer's market thing where the people came to town once a week to sell their farm goods or their wares, whatever they had, and they would do that at this particular inn. Alcohol was heavily consumed, and there was frequent aggression, especially between the inn owner and his wife. And when two civilized women came to stay there, she felt a little bit more secure and protected, and she very quickly, since both women spoke French fluently, she became attached to them, and they were empathetic to her needs as well and respectful of them. And when she explained that she couldn't eat this and she couldn't eat that, she gave them a pot and told them when at certain times she could come into the kitchen and they could make whatever they wanted to eat. So it was hard to keep a kosher diet, but we didn't have to eat the what did they have? Pigs and what are the little things that jump around? Rabbit. was going to say ducks, but they waddled. And we could go to the market and buy fruits and vegetables, fresher that we wanted to do. And then came, unfortunately, and my brother ended up in Paris at a Jewish boarding school. So it was just the two mothers and two girls, and we got along fine, and I have some pictures I'll show you that if you want to afterwards. And then the war broke out, and about 2 weeks before, towards the latter part of August, suddenly 3 women appeared. They spoke German, and they told us that they had come from Spain and that they had some connection to the Spanish Civil War in the mid-late 30s. And I don't know why their French wasn't very good. But they had been in France during that period, so they came back to where they were, and they were also housed with us. And so one of the women who spoke German very well, my mother asked her if she would go to Paris to pick up my brother and bring him back, which she did. So by September the 2nd, my brother was back with us as well. And then we were pretty much under house arrest because legally we couldn't wander around. And one of the things I do remember is that the chief rabbi of France, or of Paris, issued two refugees. There were lots of refugees in France already at that time, is that survival was of the highest priority, and that included eating what's available to you. And don't starve because you're keeping kashrut, so that you don't have to eat the pork, but you can eat the vegetables, you can eat all the other things. You have to stay healthy and well. And we did. A day or two after we had gotten to the inn, the owners had also a daughter, in our age bracket, and there was a courtyard, and Marianne and I were in the courtyard, and suddenly the innkeeper's wife came to me specifically and motioned upstairs where the mothers were taking an afternoon nap. She said, Mama, telling me, your mother should come down. There's a man here who wants to see her. Well, at that point, I had become sufficiently protective to know my mother was Jewish, Marianne's mother was not. So Marianne's mother is going to be Mama. And I turned to her and I said, go tell your mother to come down. And Annie came down and met this gentleman, and he told her, looked at her, stared at her, what do you want from me? And then said, I was told that Jews have horns, and I wanted to see that. And she burst out laughing and told me to go upstairs and tell my mother to come down, that this was a perfectly legitimate request to come down. And I didn't know why, but my mother came down, and then they both laughed. And he became our protector, our benefactor, for the remainder of the time that we were in Paris, or in France. He had a large estate and a beautiful garden. He had a gardener who planted fruits and vegetables. There were fruit trees and there were vegetables growing, and we were free to pick and to take what we wanted. And they set aside a place in the kitchen if my mother wanted to cook something for us. She was free to do so. And the chauffeur would pick us up in the morning. We could spend the day there, and then in the late afternoon or evening would take us back. And he remained on that level with us until the day that we left Laval to go back to Havre, where we're going to catch the boat to go back towards America. And then we spend a night on the train, traveling, and this is particularly for the American public what I'm going to tell you. We were strolling. It was a beautiful day. They had seen a sign somewhere that there was a movie playing. What's the name of the child actress? Shirley Temple, thank you. My memory is terrible. Shirley Temple. We'd never been to a movie theater before. That just wasn't done in those days. And so Annie and her daughter and my brother were looking for the movie theater where that was playing, and I was walking with my mother along this road, following them, but a distance behind, and suddenly a tall person, a tall man, 10-year-old, everybody was taller than me, right, was walking towards us, a person of color. I had never seen this. Frankly, I didn't even know that such a thing existed because of the sheltered life we had lived. And I stared at this person, and I turned and I said to my mother, did you see? And my mother was yanking, Mom, turn around, it's rude to stare at people. And I said, did you see this? And her answer was, God made all kinds of people. Those are the chocolate people, and we're the vanilla people. I can still hear her words in my ear. I raised my children with that, and I have told that, hopefully with the same impression it had on me, to hundreds of other people. Bigotry is not part of our lifestyle. We don't judge people by their outer appearance. We judge them by their behavior. And this man just walked on. And we never got to the movie theater because there was an air raid siren right after that, and we had to find shelter. And by the time the siren, had given us the relief, the thought of the movie had already passed us. And then it got time to board the ship. It was December, so daylight was over very shortly. We must have boarded the ship somewhere maybe around between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon until we were settled. And this was a commercial ship. The middle of it was an empty, like a tank. That's where the merchandise would go in. And then there were cabins. There were altogether about 200 people. That included the crew. And we were all below deck because the seas were very rough. And we sailed late in the day, first to England, and then slowly out into American waters. And somewhere along the way we noticed, and my mother was seasick the whole time, and there was a life-threatening thing that Annie was, again, with my mother, and the 3 children were together in the next cabin. And that doctor didn't seem to like the idea of having refugees on the ship, and gave some medication that would have done her in. And Annie immediately picked up on that and disposed of it, and my mother survived and was very, very sick. And we ended up in New York on Ellis Island, and we spent a few days there waiting for our ship. My father had made arrangements for us. He didn't know what day we were going to arrive. And then from New York to Havana, it was 2 days by boat. Annie and Marianne had to stay behind because she had picked up some infection, so she couldn't leave right away. And my parents were blessed to arrive in Havana on their wedding anniversary day, so that ended well. And then Annie and Marianne showed up a few days later. We lived in the same apartment in Havana. I loved every day that I was there. I have nothing but nice things to say about the Cuban people. And I hear from people who are visiting now that they haven't changed for the worse, so it should be good. And we spent a year and 2 weeks in Cuba. We shared this apartment not only with Annie, her husband and daughter, but with my aunt and uncle who joined us in between. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, but we had plenty of room for anything and everything. And we were the last to leave. And we arrived in New York, February the 2nd of February, on a Sunday. And on Monday morning, my father registers in school in New York City. And we spent, 6 months in New York. And during that time, my brother became a newspaper carrier and threw the papers and earned enough money to buy a bicycle. And I was sent to a camp in Maine called Sky Farm Camp, and I still have the jewelry box that I made for myself while I was there. And my mother became a home caregiver for women who had babies, and like a home health aide kind of thing. She was a doctoral candidate at the university, but she also had a teacher's license, and some first aid and health skills were part of her training to become a teacher. So she supported the family. We had an apartment in New York for the few months we were there, and my father went on a training farm. He had to choose between dairy farming in Connecticut and chicken farming in South Jersey. The chickens won out. And sometime the latter part of October of 1941, we moved to Vineland. And a new chapter in our life began. That was my adventures on the St. Louis. The person that I am today, I owe to my parents. And I think my grandson is here with me. Some of the things that I was raised with, I tried to imbue on my children, but it didn't go beyond the next generation, because there was another partner in the family relationship who didn't have the same life experiences. So that's it. The adventure of St. Louis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bickhardt. That was wonderful to hear that history that you lived through. As I said before, I see you around town all the time. I see you here every 2 weeks. I never knew this about you, and I'm delighted that you were able to share this with us.
If you want to see, this is my mother and what we looked like at about the time that we left. And this is the gentleman that had the estate. This is Annie, this is my mother, this is Mary Ann, and this is me.
I want to see.
Oh, absolutely, I'll leave it here. And this is her as a bride, Mary Ann as a bride, with her parents. Any questions, anybody? Okay. No, this is Mary Ann and this is me. And my mother had embroidered it.
Ruth, do you remember what date you got to leave France? Or approximately, if not exactly?
It was December the 23rd.
That you left France?
Yes.
Of
1939. We spent, barely 6 months there.
When did the Germans come to occupy France?
Maybe 40? Yeah.
No, we were there.
Yeah, we got out and they looked for it.
That's what she...
Okay. So anyone who wants to look at Mrs. Bickhardt's pictures or ask her questions, she'll be here. In the interim, may I have a motion to adjourn to conference meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Meeting is adjourned.